The year is 1633. An old man kneels in the middle of a courtroom in Rome, 70 years old, the most famous scientist in Europe. And this old man is being put on trial for saying that the Earth moves. He is Galileo Galilei. By now you've probably heard something about Galileo's trial. Maybe you remember the phrase, "and yet it moved." Maybe you learned that the church punished him for being an enemy of science. Today we're going to talk about what actually happened, what exactly Galileo said in court, why the church targeted him, and what lies behind that famous legend that has been repeated for 400 years. If you're ready, let's go back to late 16th century Florence. First, let's clear something up. Galileo was not the man who proved the Earth was round. The ancient Greeks already knew that. What Galileo did was something far more radical. He said that the sun does not orbit the Earth. The Earth orbits the sun. This idea had actually been proposed about 100 years earlier by Copernicus, but Copernicus presented it as a mathematical hypothesis, in the style of, if we think about it this way, the calculations become easier. Galileo did something different. He pointed his telescope at the sky and said, "This is not just beautiful math, this is real." And this is exactly where the trouble begins. In 1609, Galileo took a new instrument that had been invented in Holland and built his own improved version. By today's standards, it was inferior to even the cheapest toy telescope, but in the world of that time, it was a miracle that revealed things the eye could not see. He saw 4 moons orbiting Jupiter. He discovered mountains and craters on the surface of the moon, even though church teaching held that celestial bodies were perfect, smooth spheres. He noticed that Venus, just like the moon, went through phases. This last discovery was critical, because the phases of Venus could only be explained if it was orbiting the sun. The old model, the Earth-centered model of Ptolemy, could not account for this. Galileo wrote about all of this in a small book published in 1610. It was called Sidereus Nuncius. The book exploded across Europe. Galileo became a star overnight. Kings, cardinals, and scientists all wanted to meet him. But every success has a price. In the history of science, this is especially true. Galileo's ideas began to cause discomfort in certain circles, especially among scholars devoted to the Aristotelian tradition. These people had been teaching Aristotle's understanding of physics for centuries, and Galileo's findings were shaking the foundations of that doctrine. So they began to file complaints against Galileo with the church. Most people imagine the following: that the church immediately came after Galileo, threw him in a dungeon, and tortured him. But it didn't happen that way at all. In fact, some of Galileo's closest supporters were cardinals. Even Pope Urban VIII had been Galileo's friend for years. He was a man who drank wine with him and debated philosophy. In 1616, the church issued its first warning. Cardinal Bellarmine privately told Galileo, "You may teach the Copernican theory as a hypothesis, but you may not defend it as truth." And Galileo agreed, at least at that moment. For the next 16 years, he was careful. He gave lectures at the University of Pisa and published writings on other topics. But on the inside, he was growing impatient, because what he saw through his telescope was so clear. The Earth was not at the center, and not being able to say so was driving him crazy. In 1632, the final straw came. Galileo published a book called Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. The book was structured as a debate between 3 characters. One defended Copernicus, one defended the old Ptolemaic model, the third was a neutral observer. On paper, it looked like a balanced discussion, but anyone who read the book understood. The character defending the old model, whose name was Simplicio, was made to look like a fool. Worse still, some of Pope Urban's own past statements had been put in Simplicio's mouth. This is what enraged the Pope. A man he had been friends with for years had, indirectly, made him look like a fool in a book. At least, that is how the Pope interpreted it. Some historians say that interpretation was unfair, but at that moment, it no longer mattered. Galileo's greatest political protector had turned his back on him. And so, in the spring of 1633, a 70-year-old man set out on a difficult journey from Florence to Rome. The Inquisition wanted to question him. With today's transportation, you can drive that distance in about 3 hours. In those days, it was an exhausting journey that took many days. The trial began in April. It lasted 3 months. And here is where the popular story diverges from reality. Galileo was not tortured. Was he threatened? Yes, technically, yes. According to the rules of the Inquisition, the instruments of torture were shown to him. But the vast majority of modern historians agree that this threat never moved beyond a formality. The Inquisition did not want to physically harm a 70-year-old scientist who was the pride of Europe. What they wanted was a scene of submission. a public act of repentance that everyone in the courtroom could see. On June 22nd, Galileo, dressed in the white robe of a penitent, knelt before the court. He read from a prepared text. He stated that he rejected the Copernican theory, that the Earth did not move, and that he would no longer defend such ideas. According to the popular story, after Galileo finished reading his recantation, as he was rising to his feet, he muttered, "And yet it moves," as if it were one final act of defiance against the church, as if it were a hidden rebellion, hinting that he still held on to his belief in the truth. It's a beautiful story, but it almost certainly never happened. The first record of this phrase being attributed to Galileo dates from about 120 years after the trial. In other words, it is a legend that emerged decades after Galileo's death. On top of that, saying such a thing in the courtroom would have been suicide in the literal sense. Galileo was not a foolish man. After erasing 70 years of his life with his own pen, he was certainly not the kind of man who would then waste it shouting slogans on his way out the door. The court sentenced him to house arrest. He spent the remaining 9 years of his life in a villa near Florence. During this house arrest, he continued his scientific work. In fact, the book considered to be his most important work, Two New Sciences, was written during those years. This book is regarded as one of the founding texts of modern physics. It contains ideas about gravity, motion, and material science. One of the giants on whose shoulders Newton stood was Galileo, and that giant's last great contribution was written precisely while he was under house arrest. Galileo died in January of 1642, the same year Newton was born. History has its poetic moments. So what does this whole story tell us? The conflict between the church and Galileo was not simply a fight between science and religion. That picture is too simple. There was politics in it. There were personal rivalries, jealousies, bad timing, and poor communication. What put Galileo on trial was not only the church's fear of science, it was that he had alienated his own supporters through his own behavior. 359 years later, in 1992, Pope John Paul II made an official statement. The church admitted that it had erred in the case of Galileo, an apology 3.5 centuries late, but still, it came. Galileo's trial does not give us only one lesson. It gives us many. It shows what happens when authority tries to suppress the truth, but at the same time, it also shows how even the brightest minds can fail to read political dynamics. Galileo was right, but being right was not enough. And yet, 400 years later, we still know his name. The names of the cardinals who put him on trial are remembered only by historians. Perhaps that too is a kind of justice. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. Are you curious about other misunderstood stories from the history of science? Leave a comment below and let the next video be about that one. Take care of yourselves, and don't forget to look up at the stars. Goodbye.